Janet and I on our what's become a routine morning walk through Friday Woods. Since lockdown was eased, we've been able to get out at least once a day, and our dogs, Betsy and Tegwin, who you can probably see up there in the distance, love the fact that we are able to go out at the same time every day, to the point that they actually remind us that it's time to make our wood walk. And we always walk the same way through the woods, partly because it allows me to gauge my level of fitness, but also because we know how long it's going to take and we can build it into the routine of our day. And as we walk up this slope in Friday Woods, we're going to come to a tree that's marked, and has been marked for a long time, with what I think of as a waymark. There it is, probably put there by army units on manoeuvres through this military training area. And we see that tree and we know where we are. Well, we know where we are already anyway. And we're going to come upon another trail through the woods, through the bracken and through the briars. And Tegwin, as you can see, is trotting ahead, and the reason he's trotting ahead is because he knows there's one particular patch of grass which for some reason he finds peculiarly tasty, and it gives him a couple of minutes longer to chew it if he's that far ahead of us. So you can see everything about the walk is familiar. Each of the trees that we see, we recognise, and we'd probably notice if anything had happened to any of them in between the walks that we make. You know, if branches had fallen, or in spring if they've started budding and showing growth. We can even place sometimes in those walks certain birds. We know where we're going to meet the song of a wren, for example, in one particular place, and a chiff-chaff. In fact, there are some days where you can say, oh, the chiff-chaff's moved from over there to over there today, and we know it's the same one. We've even managed to spot the same muntjac deer on occasions in the same place. So much so that Betsy, unlike Teg, who is more interested in the favourite bits of grass, as you just heard, Betsy will go looking for where the muntjac is meant to be in the midst of those woods. It's a fascinating metaphor, really, for me. I grew up in a forested area, or near a forested area, in Epping Forest, down nearer London than we are now. And I became very familiar with an awful lot of that forest. Not all of it. It's a big area of forest land of various different characters, depending on where you are in it, much the same as Friday Woods is. But I knew my places, just as we know our walk through Friday Woods now, or walks, because we have one or two different routes, but that's our peculiar favourite one, the one that I've been bringing on this morning. Now, I don't actually take kindly to people who always refer to having been on a journey when they're talking about some event or series of events in their life or in the life of their church. In a strange sort of way, the pilgrimage metaphor is one that's been done to death a lot of the time in churches, and a lot of the time by people who've never been on a pilgrimage in their lives and yet insist they've been on a journey. Let me tell you, I've done 2 pilgrimages in my time, in recent years. The first to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, the famous old pilgrimage which I walked in 2007 with my friend and fellow minister, now retired, Rob Houghton. And then 5 years ago, Janet and I, my wife and I, we walked St Cuthbert's Way from Melrose Abbey in Scotland, in the Borders, across the English-Scottish border, across the Cheviot Hills, down through Northumberland to Holy Island. I can tell you, and Janet can tell you in particular, I think, because that was her first experience of such a pilgrimage, that you spend a lot of time exploring the road that's in front of you, and recognising that you are using as a guidebook other people's experiences. That although we walked, well, I say alone, but in both cases there were a pair of us, although the pair of us in each case walked as it were alone, we walked in the footsteps of some great people, some dating back 1,000 years. We walked on paths that had been cut by thousands, millions perhaps even, of pilgrims before us. Even St Cuthbert's Way, which in pilgrimage terms isn't that old as such, certainly not formally so old. Even St Cuthbert's Way shows us, not just by virtue of the maps and the guides that we took with us, but the land itself, the path we should take. There are only very few places on that pilgrimage, and very few also on the pilgrimage in Santiago, where it was possible truly to lose your way. Although I have to say that Rob and I, and Janet and I, both did actually manage that amazing feat. But we soon got back on track when we began looking for the waymarks. I showed you that tree in that bit of film earlier, particularly because I wanted to use that example. We know that route. We walk it every day. It's not an issue for us. But emblazoned on that tree, and on other trees actually in Friday Woods, you will find marks like that set there to say you are going the right way. It may not look as if you are going the right way. You may be concerned, you may be tired, you may wish that you didn't have to put one foot in front of another. You may wish that someone would come along and rescue you. You didn't have to keep walking the rest of the way to wherever your destination was that day on your pilgrimage. But you could take comfort in the fact that you knew where you were going, you knew the route. I want to show you something else now in the next bit of film. Let me show you this. Though it isn't obvious, not really, even on film, that is in fact a badger trail, or maybe a fox. Teg's just investigating it because he can smell badger or fox, so just to prove my point. But you see how it's been cut through all that fern and undergrowth. Now you'll have seen in that film how quite difficult it was really to see the path that the badger had taken through the undergrowth. But once you've seen it, you can't really unsee it. You know it's there. Now of course I was aided by the incredible 200 times more efficient an hour's canine nose of Tegwin, who got interested in what I was filming and could say, what's that? Badger. Or fox, or whatever it was that had used that trail most recently. But that trail wasn't new. It hadn't been cut the night before. It's a trail that a creature of the night, usually, a fox or a badger, has carved through that bracken and that undergrowth over the course of many years. Not obvious, certainly not to human eyes, although it is to canine noses, but definitely there. And once it's there, once you know it's there, you can't unsee it. Now, we didn't follow that one, obviously, because it's through briars and undergrowth, much more like a tunnel than a path. But the ones that we do follow are very clear. They can be seen. Now, in the church, we make much of pilgrimage. We make much of walking the way of Jesus. In fact, we remind people that originally Christians weren't called Christians. They were called, one of their earliest descriptors was followers of the way, meaning the way of Jesus. So I guess the pilgrimage motif is one that's been with our faith from the very beginning, mostly because of the sense of our forebears being sent out from Jerusalem and from Palestine into the every area of the world as both pilgrims and practitioners of the faith, as missionaries, as those who are carrying the word. But of course, they were all carving new paths. Subsequently, we have followed those paths to our great advantage. Obviously, it's of comfort to know that someone has been where you have been. It's of comfort to know that the path you are on must lead somewhere because someone's carved it, even if it's only a badger or a fox in terms of Friday Woods. But there comes a time when the road before us isn't so obvious. There comes a time when the path before us is multifarious. There's more than one trail, there's more than one badger, there's more than one fox in Friday Woods, there's more than one muntjac. But there comes a point where you have to make a choice. Now, the church is no different in that regard. Throughout its history, the church has come to a point where it has to make a choice. Sometimes that choice is momentous. Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses onto the onto the door of Worms Cathedral. Henry VIII deciding that he had divine permission to divorce his brother's widow, who he'd been married to for over 20 years. I mean, this was no flash in the pan relationship, and thereby allying himself with reluctantly with the Reformation of the Church in the 16th century. You might say, in purely English terms, the restoration of the monarchy and the choice that England could have made, and Scotland for that matter, and Ireland could have made at that point in 1660. Bring back the king or continue with the idea of Commonwealth. There have been waymarks throughout history where society and the church or society has come to a point where they make a choice. They have to make a choice. The choice becomes, at the very least, binary. The path ahead isn't always so clear, or if it's clear, it's only one of many. I believe that we are at that point now, as a church and as a society. I'm in the middle of writing a song, actually, which may or may not see the light of day, which is going to speak of, it's going to be a folk song, I guess, because it has a narrative to it and a story. It's going to speak of the Lancashire cotton mill workers' decision in the 1860s to ally themselves with the cause of freeing the slaves in the United States in the course of the American Civil War, and how it cost them to do that. It wasn't an empty gesture. It wasn't a light motif of some minor political movement. These were people for whom decisions such as that cost them their livelihood, and cost them in terms of starvation. And yet they still made that decision. Now I'm writing a song about that. They could have decided, to side with the corrupt mill owners and cotton traders who wanted Britain to try and break the Union blockade of the Confederacy so they could get the cotton that was slave grown. But the mill workers put a stop to it by refusing to work the cotton. It was a moment of decision, whereas Martin Luther King said, in the end, you won't remember the words of your enemies, but the silence of your friends. The mill workers knew that in Lancashire in 1860 and stood up for freedom for all people. Well, all men, they said, but all people. A moment of decision. Well, I believe that we're at a moment of decision also in our society and in our church and churches. We're at that point where the road divides and we have to decide which way we're going to go. Are we going to strike out on a new path, one which may well have been trod before and which is clear for us? Or are we going to tread the old path, the one we are so familiar with we could walk it blindfold? Are we going to take a path which is safe but a dead end for us? Are we going to take a path that's going to take us back round to where we started? Or are we going to strike out on a new path which is clearly laid out for us and may have its difficulties, may have its distractions, may even have its deaths, but is nonetheless the path we're being called to take, to strike out on a new path with new hope, new longing, and a destination we can't really describe, but where God is calling us to be. When we make that decision, there'll be no going back. We won't be able to come back and retrace our steps and try and recreate what we had before. We will have to strike through the undergrowth, following a trail we don't know, following a path we're not sure to where we do not know, when we don't know where that path leads, and putting our hands in the guide who's gone before, Christ himself. who leads us, as the hymn says, through no darker rooms than he has gone before. It's time to make our decision and strike out on a new path. I'm going to close. Well, you'll see. Stay safe, people. And as we come back down and along a badger trail and back towards where we've parked our car, listening to the birds and watching for any movements in case we see anything interesting, we come to a tree in the woods. Now, one tree amongst how many, obviously, but this one has a significance for me because it reminds me of a poem which I'm going to close this taking stock with by reciting. And there it is. Betsy, as you can see, is ahead of me and heading towards the tree. Because if you look, old Tegwin's decided to join in. Because if you look, you can see there are two paths leading away from this tree. There's that one, and there's that one. And this is where the poem comes in, which might be a metaphor for the church. It's by Robert Frost and it's called The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveller. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference.